Authority over assisted reproduction. What powers should the HFEA have? The hashtag for the event is HFE Act, and PET is extremely grateful to the British Fertility Society and to Merck for supporting this event this evening. The UK's regulator, the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, the HFEA, they have been tasked by government to advise them what changes should be made to the Act. And this is the Act which actually set the regulator up. So at this event, we'll be exploring questions including, should the HFEA have greater powers? The UK's fertility sector is dominated really now by private clinics and also by the constant novelty and innovation in the treatments that are offered and marketed to fertility patients, including, of course, add-ons. They're always very contentious. So are fertility patients vulnerable to exploitation and therefore in need of more dedicated regulation? Some may say that the HFEA should have fewer powers. IVF has become a routine treatment. It may no longer warrant as much dedicated regulation as it once did. Should the HFEA have different powers? How do the HFEA and its powers fit into the wider legal and regulatory landscape in the UK and also internationally? Is there a duplication of regulation? And the other questions to think about is, are there gaps? Are there holes that should be filled when we're thinking about reviewing the law? Rachel is Director of Compliance and Information at the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority.
I think in the next 10 minutes, what I'd like to do is not only reflect what regulation there is and what powers at the moment, is think about where we're going in the future, because that's what we want to look forward to, maybe changes in our powers and the regulation in the future. But just to start with, just to set the scene, I think we have to think about why regulation was there in the first place. And this, of course, goes back to Mary Warnock back in 1984, when IVF was very new. There was a lot of concern. This was, huge, amazing technology, which was very new and scary for a lot of the public. I remember my parents saying that the first test tube baby, they equated it to, walking on the moon. This was a very special event. And to be able to gain patient and the public confidence in this treatment, it was important to have a regulator and regulation in place so that it was done in an ethical and safe and managed way. And where we are today, as you alluded to earlier, Sarah, is Julia Chain, our new chair of the HFEA, spoke at the PET conference, and she highlighted that our Act is 30 years old. Certainly from when I started in IVF in 1994, it's changed dramatically. It is more of a mainstream treatment. It is talked about more. There's not the taboos around fertility treatment that there was way back when I started, and certainly a long time ago. And I think that's the problem that HFEA has at the moment. Don't forget, the HFEA doesn't make the legislation. We don't make the rules up. What we have to do is make sure whatever legislation we have is that clinics comply with. And what we've got is legislation which is 30 years old, and time has certainly moved on from there. But I suppose we have to think of where the HFEA and the regulation, the powers that we've had, has been successful. And I think that we really have reassured patients over the years that treatment is offered in a safe, regulated system. And I was a PR for 10 years, worked in the sector for 25 years, and I found that working towards a regulatory framework really helped drive good practice and then enabled high quality care to be delivered to our patients. I quite liked having that framework to work towards. One of the things I think the HFEA is nothing like it in the world is that we have the largest register of treatments, and they are being used increasingly for research, and it's quite exciting, I think, where we can go in the future with that for use, for example, for artificial intelligence to be able to feed back better and higher quality information to patients. And then, of course, opening the register, we have a system where donor-conceived individuals can find out more about their donors. And we know from 2023, the first donor-conceived individual will be able to receive identifying details. And because of our regulatory aspect, we've been able to do this. And we were first in the country to regulate mitochondrial donation. And we know that other countries such as Australia have actually asked how we've done it. And we, want to emulate the system that we've got. I've certainly been very fortunate over the years to visit many countries and visit lots of IVF units. And I don't think actually I've been to many that didn't say, well, we're quite envious of the HFEA and having a regulatory framework in place to work towards. But as I said, we're now 30 years on. So is it time for a change? Now, as I said, it's good news that fertility treatment is more commonplace, but the creation of life in a laboratory remains unique. Both the sector and the HFEA have changed over time, but I still think there is a fundamental need for a specialist regulator. And it can be seen in other areas as well, such as the Human Tissue Authority has specific regulation. I think there's still a need to inspect and license and provide good quality, independent information to the public. But the way we can do this, I have no doubt, can improve in the future. But thinking about what powers that we want, I think the question is, what do we want to achieve with regulation? And this is what we want to think about over the next 12 months, because it may be that we need a fundamental change, we need greater or fewer powers, or even different powers completely. And we need to think about the driving force behind this. Why do we need to change? Yes, we know we're 30 years old with the Act, but I think the problems of the Act that we're working to in the legislation is that it's prescriptive and restrictive. We need a more agile law that we can future-proof as well. We need it to be able to cope with changes in the fertility sector. We know from where we were 30 years ago, it's a very different picture now. It's consumer focused, it's a very competitive market, and there's a lot more privately funded treatment. And we need to make sure that whatever happens in the future, the legislation can cope with significant medical and scientific developments. Certainly 30 years ago, I'm sure there was no prediction of what we'll be doing with treatments at the moment in the laboratory. So I don't think it's a question of greater, fewer, different powers. I think we've got to think what is relevant, and what is relevant to the current practice that is occurring now in the sector. Now, it's not proportionate in many cases to even suggest closing a clinic. So what we want to do is have a better regulatory framework for our powers so that we can start at the bottom and work up, and that we can be proportionate in what those regulatory actions would be. I think we'd also like the ability to look at experimental treatments and regulation, because we don't want to stifle innovation. We want to be able to move forward and treatments be more successful for patients, but we need to do that in an ethical and regulated way. Certainly, we need to simplify the consent process and confidential requirements that are under the Act. It's, as I say, it's very much changed. We're more routine medicine now, and the level of confidentiality is perhaps not required. Sarah alluded to this earlier. In the Acts, there's a lot about protection of gametes and embryos, but not a lot about protection of patients. So we need perhaps a better way to assess the quality of care provided. And we need to be more agile in response to changing clinic and patient environments. So the next steps for the HFEA is that we are reviewing key aspects to make a case of change. We're going to do a consultation in the summer, and please do engage with this and feedback to us. It's a really important part of the work. And then we will report where we would like to see change to the Department of Health and Social Care by the end of 2022. But as I said earlier, it's not the HFEA that writes the regulation and who dictates the rule. We just have to uphold what we're given. So it will be the government to decide the next steps. But we would like legislative change. And we are aware that it's not going to be a quick process. It could take years, not months, but we are supportive of this change. But we also have to remember, when any legislation is debated, it is debated in Parliament, and it is the government and whoever is there at the time to decide the changes. And it could be that we end up with a more restrictive legislation. So we just have to be aware of that. But in the future, where would I like to see this ending? I would like to see much more flexible regulation and much more flexible powers. And I would like them to be able to meet the current challenges that we face at the moment. So I would like us to have a wider range of sanctions. They're very restrictive at the moment: length of license, revocation of a license, special conditions. I would like us to think about patient protection, so that new treatments, technologies, and patients are treated fairly, and only with treatments where there's evidence that it will improve success, for example. I'd like us to be able to cope in the future with scientific development. How do we respond to gene editing, embryo-like entities, in vitro derived gametes, and how do we open the debate on the 14-day rule and move forward with that? One thing that we find very difficult at the moment at the HFEA is, although we do have some powers to regulate non-medical fertility services, there is certainly an growing trend for online services. There's no licensed premises to inspect, but there's online companies giving advice to patients, setting patients up for treatment, doing the consent process, providing information. And at the moment, we can't really regulate those effectively. And then, of course, we've got how information is provided to patients and how best we can incorporate this in our work going forwards. And then thinking about 2023 and anonymity, it was simple years ago. Patients had to wait till they're 18 to get their identifiable information about their donor. But with online DNA testing, is that something that isn't going to be possible in the future? Are donors going to be able to be found through their donor-conceived individuals through online testing? And I think that's what we need to think about as well with the regulation in the future, is how we manage this and how we manage when information is released. So I think it's going to be an exciting 12 months. We've got a lot of plans at the HFEA. We've got a working group that combines people in the sector, patients and individuals at the HFEA, who are looking very specifically at areas where we can improve and hopefully get a more up-to-date legislative framework, which is going to be more workable for both the HFEA and the sector.
Our next speaker this evening is Dr. Mohamed Taranissi. Mohamed is founder and medical director of the Assisted Reproduction and Gynaecology Centre in London.
The first question was, should the HFEA have greater powers? Should the HFEA have fewer powers? Should the HFEA have different powers? And does the HFEA need more fundamental change? Given that we're only going to have 10 minutes to discuss those questions, I think my talk is going to be focusing on potentially the first bullet point, and maybe if there is enough time, I can maybe just express some views about the last bullet point about the fundamental change that, in my view, may be required going forward. So can we have the next slide, please? So should the HFEA have greater powers? That's the first question that we were asked to explore. And I would say, can I have the next one, please? I mean, as we all aware, I think there've been recently a lot of discussions and talk about, okay, what the HFEA powers should be. Should the HFEA be given more powers to try and regulate clinics? And the particular powers that seem to have been advanced by the HFEA in many conversations and talks and presentations by senior members of the HFEA were the ability to be given additional power to sanction licensed clinics through the imposition of fines and economic sanctions. This was said to be necessary because the HFEA current powers lack flexibility, which in turn limits the HFEA ability to take proportionate action. And that's actually, in a way, what Rachel have just also mentioned in her conversation. Can we have the next one? However, in my view, if the HFEA now want to extend its remit to try and actually look into the clinical performance of clinics, then I think we need to be able to look also at the current structure and composition of the membership of the HFEA, because in 1990, when the HFEA Act was drafted following the publication of the Warnock report, IVF at that time was a new technology. It was a disruptive technology. There was a lot of concerns and uncertainty about, okay, what this technology is going to be able to achieve, creating embryos in laboratories, research that can be undertaken on those embryos. There were ethical issues that needed to be taken into consideration. There was concerns about the safety of some of the procedure to do with maybe storage of gametes, maybe the implications of the social implications of maybe, or psychological implication of donor-conceived children. So there were so many unanswered questions that required a particular type of legislation. And at that time, it was felt appropriate that the membership of the HFEA should reflect that, so that the direction of legislation should be independent from the clinical or the scientific view of the medical community. But as we all agree, I mean, things have moved on. I mean, 32 years down the line now, IVF is no longer considered to be a new technology. It is well established all over the world. A lot of these concerns and unanswered questions have been clarified, and we know exactly what to expect. And if the HFEA want to be able to maybe look into the clinical side of the IVF, which was not initially within the remit of the HFEA, and it wasn't actually foreseen to be part of what the HFEA was created for, then I think we need to seriously reconsider the composition of the HFEA. Because as we all know, the HFEA is not an expert body. The majority of the members of the HFEA are what we call lay members. It is actually enshrined in the Act that the chair and the deputy chair of the HFEA cannot be either clinicians or scientists or anything. The majority of the members should be not involved in the provision of the service or have any kind of involvement in the clinical side of this. However, if we are now trying to look at all these new technology and the fast-growing landscape of IVF and so on, I think the lay majority should be actually looked at. And I think we need to have members that have the right expertise and maybe the know-how in trying to assess and address those particular clinical, very specialized issues, if they were actually going to make decisions about, okay, what's appropriate, what is not appropriate, particularly if, based on that, they will also might be given powers to put financial sanctions on clinics in relation to their clinical performance and stuff like that. And I say this with the greatest respect for the members of the authority, because this is not a finger pointing at anybody or individuals or a criticism, because that's not really their problem. I mean, the Act contemplated at the point that this would have been the best structure of the HFEA, but I think given where we are at the moment, I think this might be an issue that needs to be reviewed. So that's as far as this particular point is concerned. Moving on to the idea of actually giving the HFEA more power to actually impose financial sanctions on clinics. Can I have the next slide, please? As a matter of fact, this is actually not a new proposal, because maybe many of the audience may not be aware of that, but the same proposal, probably identical proposal, were actually previously advanced by the HFEA almost 2 decades ago, around 2004, 2005. The chronology of this is a little bit complicated, but some of you may recall that in 2004, the government announced a review of the Act, and this prompted the HFEA to issue a list of what they consider to be problematic problems under the existing legislation. This was around the middle of 2005. This very long list of potential problems. Can I have the next slide, please? Included a section that was actually had the heading of sanctions. which the HFEA suggested the following. And reading this quotation that is extracted from this paper that was published back in 2005, it's exactly the same argument that is currently being advanced by the HFEA to try and be granted the powers to maybe impose sanctions on the clinical performance of clinic. So that's what the HFEA said at the time. The sanctions are felt to be at times too draconian. Revocation was an example, or too lenient by just putting conditions on the license. The range of sanction that the HFEA were asking for back in 2004, 2005 included fines, similar to what they are now asking for in 2022. They also were suggesting naming and shaming and requiring clinics to inform patients of negative findings. And it was the HFEA view that it would be useful to enable the regulator to charge non-compliant clinics for the cost they incur through more intense regulation. This list of problematic issues was also echoed by what the HFEA has submitted a year before to the House of Commons, the Science and Technology Select Committee. The HFEA again were asked, and this was presented by the then chief executive of the HFEA to the committee, Angela McNabb at the time. So they suggested that again a wide range of options for addressing non-compliance with license condition. They suggested a system of fines would give the authority more teeth in addressing situations which might require a firm response, but where suspension or revocation of the license could not be justified. Again, this is more or less what we are hearing the HFEA actually saying now in 2022. Next slide, please. This was actually the report of the House of Commons, Science and Technology Select Committee after the presentation and after looking into the HFEA and all the reproductive technology at the time and the relationship with the law. So the committee agreed that maybe a wider range of sanction might be required, but they were very concerned that the emphasis appeared to be on penalty and not on improving standards and systems. The incompetent and the unethical needs to be closed down, but the vast majority in the middle need to operate in a regulatory environment which encourages them to improve. There should be no deterrent to self-reporting. So following on from this, what I'm trying to say is we are now going back to exactly what's been proposed in 2004, 2005. Next slide, please. So the government ran a public consultation at the time to look at the powers that the HFEA can have in addition to the existing powers into the legislation. And the HFEA responded, and this is what, again, they put in the response. If you look at the bottom of the slides, again, the HFEA were asking non-compliance would constitute an offense and would generate liability fine. Moreover, fines could provide an effective solution for minor breaches. What is very interesting in the proposal of that time, that it was also suggested that if the HFEA were to be given power to fine clinics and impose economic sanction, that there should be an independent tribunal with which centers could lodge an appeal against the financial penalties. And this on its own, in my view, may be an argument against actually the imposition or maybe the giving the HFEA such powers, because if we have such a tribunal, which I think we should, if this is likely to happen, it will make the process more cumbersome than actually the problems that we have sometimes with the licensing situation and the conditions on licenses and the suspension and revocation and so on. So effectively, we, can I just have the next one, please? So having considered all of this back in 2004 and 2005, the government actually did not accept that this was appropriate, and the suggestion that the HFEA should be given these financial powers were actually rejected. So I haven't actually heard or seen anything different today from what has been advanced back in 2004. And unless the HFEA is capable of maybe giving us an explanation or maybe a different reason why they should be given those powers, I cannot see that the outcome will be different if this has actually been proposed again in another review of the HFEA Act. So I think I just wanted to talk about something that is practical from a point of clinics and what we can be faced with when dealing with the HFEA. And I think to try and give the HFEA powers in the current structure and composition of the HFEA, particularly financial powers, I don't think would be the appropriate thing to do. And I think it may just cause more problems. And it is something that I would say has already been looked at before and was not approved by the government. And I think the case will still be the same now. So I think these are the 2 points that I just wanted to make. Obviously, the other 2 questions may be something that can come up in discussions. If people want to clarify a few things, I'll be happy to engage and maybe express the views of maybe many in the sector that I've actually spoken to, and they seem to have similar views to what I've just expressed now.
Now, next tonight, we have Dr. Marta Jansà-Pérez, Director of Embryology at BPAS, the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, and leader of BPAS Fertility Service. She is also an Executive Officer of the British Fertility Society.
I am going to present our view based on the fact that we've recently opened our service and we've been inspected and licensed. So from that perspective, we have a view on the HFEA powers and what they should be, and in order to support, our service provision and patient care. But I also want to present from the perspective of having worked in other countries where there isn't such a strong legal framework and regulator that really looks after the care that patients are being provided in the different sort of service providers. And I think it is important to keep in mind that in this country, the Act, even though it definitely needs a review because times have changed, as we all think and we all know, it is an important legal framework that allows the HFEA to ensure that we provide high standards of care. And I say that because I've worked elsewhere in other countries, but also I've worked in this country for many years. And as Rachel has said, as an embryologist, this legal framework gives you reassurance that you're providing as good care as possible. The HFEA licenses, monitors, and inspects fertility clinics, and from my perspective, this should remain the same for the reasons that I stated at the beginning. However, the review of the Act, as we've all already discussed, is a great opportunity for us all to review the HFEA powers. And the other good thing about this process is that we have the opportunity to work together with the regulator as professionals providing care, but also with involvement with the patients. And I think, again, that's a unique opportunity that we have in this country to all work together to make sure that the legislation supports the best patient care that we can provide to patients. And it's good that everyone's voices will be heard on that. I'm going to focus, as I said, on our experience as a new unit with the regulator, but also I'm going to jump slightly ahead from what Sarah said at the introduction and look at different aspects of the Act that I think should be reviewed and will hopefully tweak the HFEA powers in a way that is good for patient care. So licensing and inspection, it's something that we've as professionals, we've all gone through, most of us several times. And even though it can be quite cumbersome and time consuming and stressful, it is a process that allows us to tweak our systems and to make sure that we have everything we need to comply with the law. And again, if the law is up to date, that should ensure that patient care is optimized. I will also say that the desk-based hybrid inspection system that the HFEA has implemented since the pandemic is one that works really well from a provider's perspective, because we can send documents to the HFEA and get reassurance as the process moves forward that we are working in the right direction and there is no surprises on the day of the inspection. However, I know that from speaking to other professionals and from my experience that it is cumbersome, it is time consuming on both sides, and it's something that should be reviewed in view of perhaps automating it, having more benchmarking levels or KPIs that we can all work towards, and that we don't all spend so much time working on the process, but mainly on the outcome, that we all have a clear view on where it is that we need to work towards. And I'm now going to cover several aspects of the Act and the regulations as they are, that I think really need reviewing. And it is, again, from our experience as a new service and previous experience in the sector. And one of them is the assessments of the welfare of the child. We all have to provide patients with a form where they have to answer several questions, and as professionals to be asked to assess the welfare of that child that is not yet born, or of any children that are yet and that are going to be affected by that birth, is really a great ask. And I think it's one that is beyond our remit, and being asked to be non-discriminatory and objective is really a challenge. And I think there is a lot of place for improvement in the process, and perhaps we should look at, whilst we open up the rules, the confidentiality rules, which we all agree that need to be opened up, given how long we've now been providing fertility care. This is something that perhaps GPs could be involved in, and we should have better processes in place to make sure that it is non-discriminatory and that we streamline the process of that sort of assessment, so that we can provide safe and fair care to people that need it. And linked to that is, of course, making sure that the law allows and supports the growing diversity of our patient population. This is something that is far behind in the Act, and something that, as the Act is reviewed, the HFEA should have more powers to support and to supervise. We've already seen challenges with shared motherhood regulations that we're struggling with, but also the Act talks about the meaning of the mother and the father. The meaning of the partner even needs to be reviewed. We have patients coming to us in polyamorous relationships. How do we deal with the welfare of the child for that group of patients? And of course, we all know we are treating different genders of people. So I think the Act and the regulator need to have the tools there to be able to support care for all those sorts of different situations. And of course, that's linked to confidentiality and the fact that our current confidentiality rules and regulations are really very strict. And the CD form really restricts how we can communicate to other healthcare providers. And that, I think, will affect patient care, and more effective communication with other healthcare providers and with GPs will only improve patient care. And so I really think that's something that should be opened up and looked at in the new Act. And Rachel has already touched on research, and I think that's a very big one that we need to review, because research in this field is blooming, and it should be. We need to be able to have a legal framework that allows us to provide safe research, and that any new developments are implemented in a safe way. And I'm talking about evidence-based care here, and the ability of the HFEA to be able to regulate and control what treatment provisions we are allowed to give and what information patients are given on new technologies. But also they need to have the ability to allow for new scientific developments to be offered to patients in a safe way. And of course, opening up the ability for us to do research with embryos can only be a good thing. It's only by understanding embryonic development in depth that we will be able to understand why is it that it fails in so many instances and how we can make it more effective and more efficient. And this ultimately will improve patient care. So I think overall what I'm trying to say is that we need to open up some of the rules and regulations that we have in order to improve patient care, but with the HFEA still being the regulator that makes sure that we are providing that sort of care that is required. Data reporting, we have now a much better system to report treatment and treatment outcomes. And this should be a great tool for us to be able to use that data as it is generated to analyze it and to do more research with that database. The HFEA has been extremely proactive and helpful in generating reports of the state of the sector, and even looking at the inequalities in care that have recently been reported by the HFEA for ethnic minorities. I think that is a great tool and a great source of information that we should be using as a sector, not just the HFEA and researchers, but also healthcare providers. And I still, again, will advocate for opening up in accessing that sort of data in a safe way. So I guess I'm going to finish by saying I think we need a review act, and this is a big review to keep up with times and with the patients that we need to care for. But this act needs to keep the focus on optimized patient care, and we need to give the HFEA the tools to implement those rules, to make sure that we all give the best patient care that we can. So the practice needs to be adapted. We need to be able to promote evidence-based care, and the HFEA should be given the powers to do that. And again, sharing knowledge as it's being generated, because that knowledge will allow us to improve the care that we provide.
Next up this evening, we have Dr. Debra Bloor, and Debra is Director of Governance at Care Fertility. Previously, she was the Chief Inspector at the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, so she perhaps has a sort of unique perspective on this.
I don't think I'm particularly unique, because I suspect Rachel and I have very similar experiences now as both being regulated and regulator. But even before I joined the HFEA, so like many of my colleagues on this call, I've been either regulated or been a regulator for more than 25 years. So my very first experience in this field was as a postdoc researcher, and I returned from mat leave early to thaw embryos for research, a HFEA licensed human embryo research project at Manchester University that were at the end of their 5-year statutory storage period in 1996. So that, I think, gives us some indication of how things have changed enormously. So I joined the HFEA in 2004, and that was in the wake of the Toft report, and then moved to care in 2016. So as a career, poacher, gamekeeper, then poacher again. I think I'm in violent agreement with lots of my colleagues on this call, in that my own experience, both as a regulator and as someone who is regulated, I feel that oversight and governance should be, and often is, a real force for good, and it's something that that I welcome. So in my role as Director of Governance, I don't know if there are many people here from the sector. I don't think an audit of practice would be done very frequently if we didn't have the stimulation and encouragement of an upcoming HFEA inspection. And audits are good because they engender improvement and continuous improvement in the sector. But my experience of my colleagues, but certainly my clinical colleagues, is that their devotion is to patient care. And if they can, they will often deprioritize those sort of regulatory quality aspects because they're actually delivering patient care face to face. So I think regulation and oversight is good, and I absolutely welcome it. I think we've seen where regulation can improve success rates potentially, and we've certainly seen the reduction in multiple birth rates that was a collaborative effort, it feels to me, between the sector and all the various stakeholders. I would say that I do believe quite passionately that the benefits of regulation is achieved most effectively where that regulation is delivered by experts. So my own experience, I believe the HFEA are experts in delivering compliance with the Act. And I think they should continue to do what they do best, which is making sure that the Act is enforced properly. But I also think, we've had some discussions in this panel about the possibility of regulating innovations or regulating clinical practice, and that I'm less sure of. And I have reasons. So in my time at the HFEA, it was a phase of my career in 2015, the HFEA was included in a so-called bonfire of the Quangos. And I was asked to work with the Care Quality Commission because we were exploring removing the HFEA's powers to some extent to reduce the regulatory burden on clinics. And it was interesting at the time, although it wasn't stated explicitly, there was a clear underlying assumption that the inspection responsibilities of the HFEA could really easily transfer to the Care Quality Commission. At the time, I was even inadvertently copied into some internal emails from the CQC that said as much. But that collaborative working that I did with the Care Quality Commission, the CQC recognised they simply didn't have the expertise to regulate the standards of the Act. So to make sure that the quality and safety of the treatment that my clinic colleagues are providing was safe and protected patients. And in fact, in the end, they ceded those responsibilities to the HFEA. And you could imagine that that's a good example of where it's the HFEA might assume the powers of another regulator to bring all of the regulation of the fertility sector under one banner. But now, although at the time that felt like a big success and it was lauded as such in the triennial review of the HFEA, now in 2022, from my perspective as the regulated in care, it's clear there's been some degree of divergent evolution, and some of the care clinics are now having to re-register with the Care Quality Commission because the advice we're getting from the Care Quality Commission is becoming increasingly inconsistent. Those agreements that were formed back in the day when I worked with the Care Quality Commission. And I think that's one of the downsides of bringing regulation from different sectors into under one banner, in that you do get this as one sector evolves and changes. Any responsibilities assumed by another regulator don't necessarily change and evolve in the same way, and it leads to inconsistency. And I think also as a group, care definitely, we've experienced a tendency for HFEA inspectors, for example, who've taken on CQC inspection responsibilities, to be more risk averse. And as an example of that, in care, many of the anaesthetists that work with us in care to deliver conscious sedation also work in the NHS, and they report back to us directly that the way they are held, standards they are held to, and the recommendations that are made to them with respect to their management of controlled drugs are much more stringent where the HFEA is inspecting us than when the Care Quality Commission inspects them. Now, I'm not for a second suggesting that unsafe practices should be overlooked, but I do feel that where an expert regulator is applying their judgment, they can sometimes, it gives them the scope to be proportionate and make sure practices are safe, but there's also proportionality in the recommendations. I think it's been mentioned that the notion of the HFEA taking some responsibility for innovation and assessing new techniques and new technologies. But again, my perception is, and also some of this is influenced by my experience, when the HFEA inspectors took over some responsibilities of the Care Quality Commission, there was a huge amount of work involved to prepare for that and to deliver it in a proportionate and sensitive way. We already have the MHRA, and it's an extraordinary body with a long established, safe and effective procedures. And alluding to what Mohamed Taranissi said, they are the experts. They have the suitable expertise to judge whether an in vitro diagnostic device or a medical device is safe and effective. And I feel that we already have an expert body, and to transfer those responsibilities or to try and assume those responsibilities would be time-consuming and expensive and potentially not straightforward. And I think the same applies when we've got organisations like the Competition and Marketing Authority, the Advertising Standards Agency. They are already in place and becoming increasingly effective at protecting patients from misleading advertising by clinics. And I personally don't feel that the HFEA needs to invest time and effort in establishing similar powers, because patients are already, there is already an organisation that can already effectively protect patients. So in respect to the notion of the ladder of increasing regulatory sanctions, I do remember that those discussions about punitive measures and fines that took place back in 2005. And even though I was an inspector at the time, I don't really think I felt they were necessary. I believed then and believe now that the sector is hugely compliant generally, and I do think that the powers, although there is this notion that before you can impose a condition, you have to conclude that a person responsible hasn't delivered hasn't met the responsibilities. But actually, just as Mohamed Taranissi said, that could include not complying with license conditions. And I'll have a really personal example. I joined care in 2016, and within just a few months, the clinic I was working at was subject to an inspection that identified a number of parenthood consent failures. And all those from the sector will know that that was a huge, that was terrible. It was a terrible thing to be found. And we immediately suspended all treatment with donor sperm because we absolutely needed to resolve the cause of the errors. We were motivated to improve because of the absolutely devastating impact on our patients. I was actually the person who had to contact those families and explain that their status as a parent could have been compromised. And I would say that me and the entire team, we needed no motivation to put things right other than the knowledge that we'd caused distress. And I mean, we absolutely recognised that if we hadn't been able to totally reassure the HFEA we'd improved and taken all the relevant corrective and preventative actions, that they could then have added a condition to our license. We would have deserved it if we couldn't have made those changes. But I really don't think the threat of something like a fine or a financial penalty was needed. We had absolutely all the motivation we needed and the support, both of the HFEA and for me personally at a corporate level, to make all those changes. So I think we have to reflect that the HFEA has got a brilliant track record of achieving its aims through engagement and collaboration. Again, going back to multiple births. And I think the application of a punitive regime could establish a really combative relationship between the regulator and the regulated. And I kind of lived through times at the HFEA when there was a more combative atmosphere long ago, but it was not a good environment to be in, and I don't believe it was effective in engendering change. I think, just like my colleagues, just to finish, I really would like the Act to be changed to give the HFEA powers to be flexible interpreting the law. I think we have to take account of changes in society, changes in the structure of families, just as everyone's discussed. The issues to do with screening, for example, and confidentiality. And really, actually, I would like to influence the legislation to change with respect to consent, particularly around parenthood. In my time at HFEA, I don't know if any of you remember the little blue code of practice book that said if you were having treatment with donor sperm, then if you were unmarried, your partner would not be the legal parent of your child. And in my time after that, I think it was the Adoption and Children Act changed the legislation and said if you weren't married and you were having treatment with donor sperm, all the male partner had to do was to the registrars and put his name on the birth certificate and would become the legal parent. And that was a legislative change in my time at the HFEA. But then in 2008, to allow a female partner to be a second parent, we then introduced a catalogue of complex consents, which inevitably sometimes fail, admittedly for the wrong reasons. We try not to. So I think there's changes in the Act that could, I absolutely support changes in the Act to streamline and improve confidentiality and consent. And also I'd like to see changes in screening. But I think the HFEA are an excellent expert body who can oversee those changes, and we leave the rest to the other regulators.
So finally this evening, we have Katy Lindemann, and Katy is an advocate and commentator on infertility and childlessness. She is a former fertility patient, and she is the founder of the Uber Barons Club.
So again, I think, we're here today, and I think it touched on the fact of protecting gametes. And I think it was just very interesting that actually, whereas it was about protecting the public against the misuse of reproductive technology, I think really from the patient perspective, it's around we're looking at exploitation by commercial interests. The baby business is a very, very different sphere than the concerns with Warnock. So I'm just going to touch on the kind of 3 different areas that were originally set out with the speech that Julia Chain said around responsible innovation and quality care, economic protection, and rules around consent and anonymity. So thinking about responsible innovation, kind of highlighting around things around where treatment should be safe and effective, and really crucially around evidence-based information and understanding of success rates. And I think, again, what I really want to focus on here, I guess, is not not just looking at whether powers should increase, but are the current powers actually being used effectively? And therefore, what does that mean? So we know that in the original Act that, informed consent, it is same as it always been that patients, it is only that they have the right counselling, the right information. And again, according to who, such information as is proper. We know that since Montgomery came in, that it did the test for whether the informed consent is based on what the patient thinks is relevant, not what a doctor thinks the patient should know. And so therefore, that's why we have guidance for clinics to meet standards of care to help provide that guidance for what kind of information should be provided. And, it's pretty clear, accurate, easy to find, enables patients to make properly informed decisions. And going in, the nature of the proposed treatment, implications of treatment, evidence of effectiveness, why the proposed treatment is being offered, how it may benefit that patient specifically. And then even more, now again, is that I was involved in one of the stakeholders, the CMA, looked at saying, what do patients think is relevant information? So we have that question of informed consent, what is material information? And they've got some very specific guidance of going, here is some guidance about the kind of information that patients think is important. And it says in the code of practice, this is the kind of things that need to be. So we already have some pretty things of going, what is important in order to be compliant with the existing legislation as it stands. And therefore, then when we as patients have to complete that consent form, we have to, the legal document that has to say, we're certain that we've been given all the relevant information we need to make fully informed decisions. And it's interesting because if you're unsure, you don't think you've been given information, your consent may be invalid. I think it's interesting, a point that was made in Montgomery, that there's something unreal about placing the onus upon asking upon a patient who may not know that there is anything to be asked about, which is why I think, for us relying on the regulator to be able to look after our interests when we don't necessarily know whether or not we are being given the right information. And so again, when we think about, and I guess I'm going to use these as questions because I'm seeing this as going, what is it that they're, in terms of what is involved in the compliance? So there may well be things that I'm asking that we can go, oh, I've got an answer about this. But if we think, how is the assessment with the code of practice? And so as far as I can see, that how do you assess whether the website is compliant, which is clearly a very big part of the CMA, is that you have the information audit tool and clinics have to provide that and fill it in. It's very specific about looking purely at information about success rates. So then in inspection, there is no information about any particular clinics. This is all anything, there's no names included. There'll be a point of saying the website is not compliant because there's one specific element. They've made that change. This is now complete and the website is compliant. Reports, this is compliant. Interestingly, at an event last year, the HFEA's own data, this was a slide presented by Claire Ettinghausen, that said that only 3% of clinic websites were compliant with the HFEA code of practice. So I guess I would just sort of question the thing if everyone's really compliant when we know that they show that they're not compliant, and yet is that, what's actually happening about it? And I also would go back to the question of saying, well, we're already protected by the ASA and we're protected by the CMA, so the HFEA don't need to be able to do that. It's already part of their remit in that they're supposed to be regulating the code of practice. And secondly, I come back to the Montgomery point. The ASA and the CMA will only look into something if a complaint is made. Again, It relies upon us making complaint when we may not know there is anything to complain about. It is part of the HFEA to make sure that clinics are compliant with the code of practice. Therefore, either it's in their current thing that we need to be given sufficient information and clinics need to be compliant, or in which case, where's the enforcement? So we know that saying that's by their own, they're not. Again, information provided to patients is compliant. This ensures that patients are getting the information they need to make informed decisions. That is what the HFEA is saying, that this is these centres are compliant. And it's very specific around saying how add-ons particularly going to be, that you develop the new add-on information audit tool. Which I also do question, is it clinics marking their own homework? Anyway, but the point is that this is be able to provide that information, and that's great for clinics to be able to look at it. And this is from the HFEA's own very recent report, the patient report, that actually patients saying they aren't given enough information about the various options. So this was, I think, came out last week or the week before. So all of these clinics who are compliant with giving patient information, according to every single one of those inspection reports, well, patients doesn't seem to be, because we're seeing, 46% say the cost wasn't made clear, they weren't explained, 34% said they didn't explain the risks. That really goes down when you look at particular add-ons. So patients who had PGTA, only 19% said the clinic explained the potential risks. So are they compliant or are they not compliant? Again, it was just interesting that actually in the quote from the HFEA said, this is in the code of practice, but our national patient survey shows this isn't always happening, and that is unacceptable. Well, so therefore, what is the sanction for something that is non-compliant? There's clearly it's not happening. So either the inspection is saying it's compliant, it's fine. Is it or is it not? Because what do we do about it? So I would challenge the question that everything is very compliant and it's all fine and nothing needs to be done. Again, patient support is compliant. Patients are treated fairly. They are all in line with HFEA requirements. But we know compliant patients aren't complying because, again, in the patient survey, the availability of counselling, the clarity was one of the lowest examples. Again, the satisfaction, lowest for level of support. So again, if either the level of compliance, all of the patients who are compliant is either out of touch with what is actually needed for patients, or what's going wrong with the inspection. Again, I find it interesting that this was the comment in the report saying the code of practice contains a number of requirements, so this is lower than we would have expected, but they were all compliant. So we're saying, how is it being judged, the fact that this is a surprise? Again, these are, we're relying on the media to uncover non-compliance. So, elements of where there was things that were recorded and they were saying, oh my goodness, regulatory action will be taken in the evidence where there's poor practice, and we check patient information on inspection. Again, no clinic name. The regulator's response in the investigation said, not compliant, not compliant, not compliant. But it's okay because they said, they said they'll change it. So we're happy with that response. Don't know, do they follow up? I don't know. But again, we're relying on the fact to uncover non-compliance questions about egg sharing. In that case, there was absolutely nothing found to be non-compliant at all. So despite patients going, I was giving completely inaccurate information, I felt I wasn't given the full picture. According to the HFEA, everything was completely compliant with regulatory requirements. So there wasn't even anything that was found to be. But again, is compliant information really compliant? If patients were saying, I don't feel that information really explained, I feel like I wish somebody had presented the scenarios to me. I can't ever know about, what happened to my DNA. So again, I would like to understand, are the existing powers being used effectively? Are the compliance checks insufficient? Are inspections looking at the right information? Or actually, is it back to that question about expertise? Are inspectors there because they're looking at laboratory procedures and all of the other things? Is it that actually the requirement to assess information in the code of practice isn't quite aligned with what inspectors are doing? Or are they just tick box exercises? Do they have to be ticked as compliant because the sanctions are disproportionate. If they're not compliant, what can we do about it? We don't want to suspend their license. So I would question, like to understand why this discordance, which part of this is lining up. And then I guess just for an economic protection. So they mentioned the power to regulate prices. I think Raj Mathur made the comment, which I would entirely agree with at the CMA event. He said, look, you know, really, I'm not aware of any other regulator who regulates prices, but it would be possible and practical to have a standard format for displaying them. So again, this was something we looked at with the CMA review, that actually, where is it possible to have example minimum and maximum costs for different patient scenarios, because clearly things will vary enormously depending on the scenario. But having examples for the kinds of things where it gives you realistic scenarios in different scenarios, that can help patients understand how and why costs might vary. And I do think these need to be based on real world scenarios. So again, a clinic where patients are expressing surprise that actually they found that their sort of one cycle was £10,000, £15,000, £18,000, £27,000, £30,000. Now, again, these may be extremes, but I think it needs to be considered what something might be. So we need to make sure that whatever is considered, that these are based on real world scenarios. And then I guess just really thinking about fair pricing and value for money, that often we think of success rates and then cost. And so very often we might go, well, that's expensive, but that's because their success rates are high. So I think it's just for us to be able to, we're having to do all the totting up, and we don't know whether something is fair. Is that a fair price? Is there a national tariff? And clearly treatment is individualized. There is no standard box, one size fits all, nor should there be. But it's us, we need to be able to have the information to understand. And I guess just the question, I'm not a regulator, so it's not for me, but I guess the thing I would question is, my question is, in the kind of, you know, the guidance for what regulators should do and what they should be able to do and what a sanction should do, is that the case? A question, this has clearly been explored, but it's clearly a model that is pretty standard for regulation, that you should have the responsive compliant model that goes up. And it's used in all sorts of, particularly in Australia, but multiple regulators use this as a very standard means of applying something between how do we encourage good practice and will revoke your license. So I asked the question, given we do have such instances of many incidents of non-compliance, is there, where's the something in the middle? And again, I've just touched on the fact of, with the different bodies, we don't get protection unless we complain about it. The HFEA is supposed to audit compliance with the code of practice. So with the fact that it's everyone's saying, well, you need to, who's responsible for it? Because as patients, it's being split between three, but ultimately if something is non-compliant, we shouldn't have to go and find out to know about it in order to complain about it. And then finally, very quickly, I think I would entirely agree in terms of the questions, because as patients, I thought it was kind of interesting that this was a couple of years ago when it was initially raised. It was really within the context of OHSS, but I think the principle of capturing that information so that we can understand the health impacts. So, the fact of what data is collected, do we have the ability to monitor the consequences of treatment on the short and long-term health? And I would also, this is something that, as we see the incidence of reciprocal IVF, back to patient information, how many patients are advised that the risk of preeclampsia goes up with egg donation pregnancies? I don't know anyone that was. It's something, health outcomes of donor pregnancies, long-term health outcomes for women, the longitudinal effects, for IVF-born children. And actually, there's all sorts of different things. What about culture medium? What about embryo biopsy, endometrial injury? What are the health outcomes? So we can think about what that might be. So I will finish off because I know I've gone over. Extending enforcement powers, maybe, but actually it's only effective if you have a meaningful and effective assessment of compliance in the first place. I don't think regulating costs is the only way to make a difference, but regulating the provision and presentation of information about costs would be extremely valuable. And again, success isn't just a live birth. We as patients desperately need to understand the health impacts of successful treatment.
the most popular question is one from an anonymous attendee saying, I agree with Dr. Taranissi that it would be good to review the composition of the HFEA members. No one at the HFEA is currently a product of IVF. I'm not sure whether we know that or not. Do the panel agree that there is a real need to ensure that donor conceived and surrogate born people are represented on the HFEA? So I don't know who perhaps would like to answer that one first. Perhaps I'll go to Rachel first, as it's about the sort of balance of the HFEA panel, and then because it's an issue that Mohamed raised, we'll go to him.
I think as to consider the membership to start with as the question, I think it is important to have a mix of both people that work in the sector. I was a member, obviously represented embryology on the authority before I started working for the HFEA. I think it's good to have a balance of people who work in the sector and understand the sector, but you also get a very good insight into more the ethical issues and patient issues, and those lay people bring to that. So I do think it's important. And of course, when we do advertise for lay people, they can be donor conceived or been involved in surrogacy. And we have had, I'm sure, people on the HFEA who have been past patients as well. So I think it's important to keep a mix. I worry if it was all people from the sector and not involved, you didn't have that oversight from the lay input, or specifically for like the genetic input, or at the moment, like, you know, use of data, you lose that expertise and that roundness of a board where it's all brought together to, you know, work effectively together. So I do strongly agree that there has to be people from the sector on there and representatives from all types of different backgrounds and circumstances. But I think that brings a strength to a board that's needed.
So, Mohamed, what are your views on this?
I think I agree with Rachel. I mean, I wasn't actually saying that the HFEA should be made only of clinicians and people who actually work in the field, because that's not what I was trying to say. I think a mix is always advisable, and it's important because as clinicians, we also sort of communicate with patients every day. We hear their views, so we're not completely detached from what the patients actually feel or would like to be delivered and so on. But I think if the HFEA now want to move into more the clinical aspect of the treatment and all the rest of it, so maybe the issue of the lay majority in the composition of the HFEA needs to be addressed. That doesn't mean that, okay, they should be excluded, but I think maybe the proportion of the lay and clinical members should be revisited and addressed.
I'd just add to that, it is obviously, it's not the HFEA who appoints, this is done through government and Department of Health and the Secretary of State ultimately, but we do have a scientific advisory committee, so we do have quite a few extra people that from the sector and experts in their field to advise more on the clinical aspects of both regulation and what's happening in the sector as well.
Yeah, if I may maybe just respond to this if possible. I think that the committee that Rachel is referring to, I think, again, it's the same issue, because if you look at the proportion of people who are actually on this committee, who are actually working in the field and so on, they're still a minority. And if you look at the minutes of any of the meetings that the SCAC sort of committee is published on the HFEA website, you will see that the number of maybe executives that attend the meetings are probably far more than the membership of the actual committee. And as far as I know, on this particular committee, there was only 2 clinicians that were actually appointed on that committee for a number of years. One of them have never actually attended any meeting for about 2 or 3 years. So we're talking about one clinician who is actually supposed to be on the committee that is expected to make decisions about issues of clinical importance to a wider part of the sector.
have just advertised for membership, and we have restructured that committee. And of course, we've got Tim Child, who is a clinician working within the sector, who is on that committee, and also Raj, who's the chair of BFS at the moment. And we have just actually gone out to advertising for new members for that committee from the sector.
As a satellite service operating for several years, now working with several different HFEA licensed centres, our patients often ask what our success rates are and where we are on the HFEA website. And we can't give them a reply. As satellite data is not available to patients, even though there are more satellite centres on the HFEA website than there are HFEA licensed centres. Are there any plans to modernise the experience for our patients? Additionally, there are other satellite services which operate under the disguise of a full licensed centre, that the data is not available at all to inform patients, or even the HFEA itself. Would anyone care to comment on this? So, sorry, it's a bit of a mangled question, but Rachel, I think you're going to have to go with this one first, and then I'll look to Debra.
Obviously, providing the right information is important to patients, but at the moment, the way that we license is obviously through a licensed process, and we license the clinic where the treatment is undertaken. We do have the ability to license and visit satellite centres and also non-medical facilities, as I mentioned, but this is something that we really need to think of going forward. And maybe with the change in legislation and modernising it, we can try and think how we report statistics to the patients, and then that choose a fertility clinic, which is where patients go to look at the HFEA reported success rates. We might in future be able to put the link satellite centres to that as well.
And Debra, did you want to come in on this one?
I think it's something we're aspiring to do. So CARE has a number of satellites. I think we're in that grey area that, you know, Katy spoke of so passionately, in that we have to make sure that our data is our satellites, we can provide the data on success rates, and we can express it in the same way that the HFEA do, and that's what we're aspiring to do, and we're actually trying to do that. And I think we've been trying to work with you, Rachel, to find out exactly what the rules are for generating the HFEA success rates on their website, so we can give exactly that direct comparison for our satellites. I know it sounds a pathetic thing to say, but it's not as straightforward as it sounds. It's actually quite a, you know, you have to know what all the rules are that the HFEA apply to generating success rates, to be able to recreate that in your own clinic, to be able to sort out what the success rates are for your different satellites. And I agree it should be done. I'm sure patients need it. They definitely need it, and we would aspire to do it.
So the next question is from Olivia Montuski, and it relates to donor conception. And so donor conception is different to a pregnancy achieved with help from IVF with parents' own gametes. Who represents the interests of the child to be conceived with donated gametes? Whose responsibility is it to think about the needs of this child to be told and have access to information about their donor progenitor? And in relation to this, whose responsibility is it to make sure that potential parents are prepared to take on being a parent to a donor-conceived child? These are relevant concerns for patients at UK clinics, but also for those who start their quest for a family in the UK and then go abroad, often with support from a UK clinic. So I think there are some perhaps ties in a little bit there to welfare of the child issues, and to think about that. And also, I suppose, with 2023 and the opening of the register not that far away, it's something that should perhaps be, you know, be thought about. So I'm afraid, Rachel, I'm going to go to you again first.
I think what's important to remember, and it sort of follows on from Katy's talk as well, is that the HFEA can only regulate what is law. We can actually only act on what is law. So in the legislation, and in the code of practice, we've got mandatory requirements, and that's what's in the Act. And it's also what's in the licence conditions and the general directions. Now, there's a lot of guidance in the code of practice, which helps clinics achieve compliance with a licence condition or direction, because it's giving an idea of how good practice should look. So, for example, with this, we're talking about counselling for donors and having effective and good counselling. But the legislation only says that there has to be an opportunity, a suitable opportunity for proper counselling. So that's all that we can assess and actually uphold from a regulatory perspective. The rest is guidance. We can comment on that, and we can try and urge compliance with the guidance in the code of practice. But if we think that counselling around donation and implications of that, especially in light of 2023, then that's something that can be discussed and debated as we go forward to look at areas where it does need changing in the legislation.
Does anyone else want to come in on donor conception? No, I'm not seeing any takers for that. Okay, so welfare of the child, I think that was something that you raised, Marta, and so we have a question from Sharon Petal saying the idea of removing welfare of the child is very worrying. I'm not quite sure you were suggesting removing it completely. Yes, review it as the form is insufficient, but do not pass the hot potato to GPs who are already overworked, and their safeguarding experience is often more extreme. I've worked with families, including in care proceedings, where this, if it's been fully explored and assessed, and implications counselling was a deeper and longer process, fully paid for by clinics, then these families would not have gone ahead, or I think an ethics committee would have said no. So I think, Marta, if you go first on this one and say what you were thinking with this, and whether, what your idea was about, whether you are actually advocating it for it to be removed completely.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. And that gives me the opportunity to clarify what I was trying to say, that the current process, I don't think, allows us to assess it effectively and objectively. And I do worry about relying on a form and a questionnaire that patients give to us to be able to assess that. And as professionals, we are not trained or qualified to do that. What I'm advocating for is a more multidisciplinary approach, and one that allows us to explore through a medical questionnaire the medical history of the patients, but also to reach out to other healthcare providers to try and assess that welfare, rather than base it on a form where we ask several questions to patients. And, it is very difficult for us as an MDT, as a new clinic. I can say, we often have discussions where there is no agreement, and I wonder and I worry about this discussion in another service or, with another team, what might be the outcome of that discussion. So I am advocating for a more streamlined and objective system that does not discriminate against people and that doesn't deny treatment to people who should be having it.
Does anyone else want to come in on this issue?
I'll comment.
Debra.
So obviously I came into working in a licensed clinic, and I think my experience, so I've also lived through the change when we used to ask all clinics to write to a patient's GP. And I guarantee you, if you wrote to my GP and asked, was I suitable, was there something, they wouldn't have a clue who I was. So I think that wasn't particularly effective, and it was very time consuming, and sometimes GPs would want to be paid to give an opinion and things like this, and it was just really difficult. And the HFEA, I believe, went through a big not a big consultation, but they were certainly well considered by the authority as to whether the effectiveness of asking a patient's GP, were they suitable to have a child, was rejected. And so we reverted to the questionnaire. Now, I know that when I took responsibility for a clinic, those questions about was someone suitable were really hard. And I think what we did as a team was we got to the nub of it, that the welfare of the child says that we shouldn't provide treatment if there's a serious risk of harm. And I think it is really important to consider what is the serious risk of harm. And I have to say, in my I live in a busy metropolitan city in Manchester, and people are very honest about their experiences of mental health or of drug addiction or of brushes with the law, and these things are in our welfare of the child assessment. And I would say that at that point, when a patient raises an issue of an experience, of a history, then our team would pause and then seek extra, because you are absolutely right, Marta. We are hopefully reproductive experts, not people who will judge someone what risk of harm someone poses to a potential future child. And I think we took a very clear view that once we felt that we were unable to make a decision, just as you're describing, or reach a consensus, that's when we would reach out and seek guidance. So, for example, we've sought advice from probation services, from social services, and if we couldn't get information, then we would refuse treatment, because we can and should do that if we can't be reassured that there is no risk of serious harm. So I think there are mechanisms, but for me, it was very much in terms of bringing the team to realise it's not all up. It's about restricting this to the serious risk harm. The saddest case I was involved in was a young woman who had mild to learning difficulties and wanted to be a parent, but we were provided with information that suggested that people did not think, her family did not believe she was capable of looking after a child, and social services couldn't or wouldn't, or her GP, support us because we couldn't. They didn't know when she had it. They would only judge whether or not she needed support from social services, and potentially could have her child removed from her when she'd had the child. So we were never able to, how can anyone give you a prospective decision on whether someone is going to be a good parent or a bad parent? There might be, and that was the grey area we're in, and we actually didn't provide treatment. And I wonder about that young woman to this day. She could possibly be a fantastic parent, but we were hamstrung because we didn't want to provide the treatment if in fact that child potentially would have been taken into care. And that's probably the hardest decision I've had to make, which was in this middle grey area, and we couldn't help her, and I felt bad about that. But generally, with the support of others, even someone we've had probation services, and we've had people who've said, this person has been to jail for a crime, they have served their time as a criminal, but actually their access to children was never restricted. They've never had to have supervised access to their existing children, and we take that as an indicator that a court has decided that person posed no risk of harm. So I think there are mechanisms there. It's just about accessing them, and we found that patients are very helpful in that they are quite honest, quite surprisingly so, perhaps. Of course, I don't know all of, maybe lots of patients lie, but certainly I think it can be done. I think it can be done, and it's not easy, it's not straightforward, but I think it can be done.
Can I come back on that? Yeah, sorry. I just think, as a patient, and I have been a patient myself, if I was presented with that questionnaire, I would worry that if I say yes to any of those questions, I'm going to be refused treatment. And I wouldn't blame anyone for not giving us a straight answer, if you see what I mean. And this is why I worry about us being objective and fair in the care we provide when we do the assessment of the welfare of the child, because it is tricky for patients to be presented with that, and then extremely difficult for us to do those assessments. I get it that you can reach out to other professionals, but there are cases like the one you described, where you wonder whether denying treatment to patients is actually putting them in a very, very difficult position, including mental health issues. And it is really very difficult. This is why I think the only way to make it objective is to do a DBS check on all of the patients we treat. Because really you're worried about people who will abuse children. But otherwise, how do we make it fair and objective? This is what worries me. And I don't know if Katy would have a view on that, having been a patient herself.
Katy?
I think it's really interesting, because I remember finding it's when you're going through all of the it's quite a blow, in a sense that objectively I can fully appreciate why it exists, but I think it is one of those things where you go, no one, if you had to fill out all this paperwork every time people had sex, the human race would not. And the fact is going, any old any person can go and get themselves knocked up, but you know, people who are going through that, I understand why it exists, but I couldn't offer a point one or the other, because I can only imagine how difficult these decisions must be. And yeah, I'm not sure what the right answer is. I don't think there is one.
I think it's a sort of useful comment perhaps from Jane Stewart on this, about, you know, her experience in, you know, saying that she agrees that the form is not a complete or effective assessment, and just helps is a tool to help you build up a relationship with the patient. And in the NHS, they have access to safeguarding approaches, but of course the problem is that they come into force and into effect once the child is born, and so the social services don't have any remit before that person conceives. And I think, you know, that's where we're at. Now I want to move on from welfare of the child and from donor conception, because they're not there's lots of comments about that, but I wanted to go now to a question from Julian Hitchcock saying, would Rachel please suggest how the government framework might be improved to enable more adaptive governance? Does she consider, for example, that the SCAC, so that's the I can't remember what it all stands for now, the Scientific Advisory Committee, basically, for the HFEA, could be granted powers to respond to emerging scientific developments, such as novel genome editing techniques? And if so, what conditions of independence, transparency, and accountability would there need to be in place?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a big question, that, and that's something that certainly can be debated further on this year when we start to question areas of the Act and responsibilities where they lie. I think what we do know is that the Act doesn't work for the new technologies and for the science that's developing, and it's just too prescriptive at the moment, isn't it? So I think we need to think about where those responsibilities lie, and then how they would be regulated, and whether what regulatory remit SCAC might have in the future. Obviously, it's important for anything that's new, anything that we need to introduce carefully and responsibly. It does need some sort of regulation, and I'm sure that will be spoken about by, you know, our chair and our chief exec, and on the working panels that we've got going forward as well.
The HFEA has become predictable and ineffective in dealing with patient exploitation at varying levels, especially during their inspections. However provocative my comments, I wondered what the HFEA and the panelists think. So I think that's probably, I don't think it was you, Katy, anonymously asking that question, but I think that's the, so I think what can be done, this person obviously feels that the HFEA is currently ineffective. So what could be done under the current powers, and what difference would changing the law make? So go to you first, Rachel.
As I said earlier, what we have to think about is that what is actually in the law and what is guidance. So we as a regulator can regulate against the law. So that's, as I said, what is in the Act, what is in the general directions, and what is in the standard license conditions. Now, some of that is very specific. So we know about the statutory storage periods for embryos. We know about, offer of counselling or the PR's role. But some of it is just guidance. And it is guidance about websites. It is guidance about treatment add-ons. It is, yes, we have to be able to provide proper information, but that's not defined. And I think if we can think about where that protection of patients is and give us more flexibility in that, so that we can then actually do something about it. You know, Katy mentioned a checkbox exercise. What we do is we do go to clinics and we look at websites, we talk to patients, we look at the information that they're providing. But of course, we can just, in the license condition, it's just that proper information have to be given. You know, we have to make a judgment on that, and it's very difficult for us, against a very restrictive legislation, to be able to widen that because obviously then it's subject to challenge. So I think having a wider range, different powers and different step ladder that we do go up, so we're proportionate, will be important in the future so that we can become more effective as we go forward.
I guess it comes down to the language, because on the one hand, you've got in those reports, this is compliant. And then on the other hand, this is not, saying we have evaluated. So I think, again, I see from the patient perspective, being able to understand, because on the one hand, it's exactly as you say, that it's being able to understand of going, is there any recourse if everything, exactly as you say, is saying, look, maybe guidance. And if it is that only 3% of websites, I think the HFEA's own analysis, are not compliant, again, I'm not, the words, being able to do that, then is there any, or is that absolutely, as you say, absolutely fine, and it's reliant on the ASA to go, well, that's misleading. So I think exactly as you said, that it's where does it fall between, because saying is something, I say it is, if all of the reports say it is compliant, it being able to understand what does that actually mean, as you say, because it's ultimately according to exactly what's that's is that fit for purpose. So it's being able to have that clarity.
Can I comment? So it's really interesting because I kind of fit between these two perspectives, and so I know that as someone who was regulated and inspected about a month ago in one of our biggest clinics, I spent a huge amount of my time going through the code of practice and looking at every single word that says you must tell your patient about this. And gosh, Kate, I'd almost like to take you home with me to my clinic and say, this is what the code says. It is guidance, but the code says I have to tell you X. This is, and literally we go through our line by line, or here it says this, and that for me is as an exercise in reviewing all our information. Then of course I have to check, did we actually give it out? Because that's key. It's all in good. I've got this beautiful patient information that gives all the information about the evidence base, the risks, the whatever it is. But if I never give it to anybody, it's no use to man or beast. So that's my approach to being inspected. It doesn't feel ineffective from my perspective as someone being regulated. And you would say, there's everyone on this call is going, well, she would say that she used to work for the HFEA, so I recognize that the trust in me or whatever might be limited from that perspective, but it doesn't feel ineffective when the HFEA come and regulate me. And like Rachel says, it might be guidance that this information is provided to patients, but my take is that if I fail to give information in line with guidance, then that standard license conditions is invoked, and I could be considered not to have given my patients proper information. I think there might be a sort of a discrepancy between when we kind of between what patients want to know and that guidance, and that's probably where we could be better, where collaboration between the HFEA and patients is better, because what you were saying, Katie, about these are the things the patients want to know about. But of course, if we took enough patients, some will want to know different information. I personally believe at the moment that if I sat down with every single line in the code that tells me what I'm supposed to tell my patients, it's too much and they're overwhelmed and they're not reading it. So the stuff they do need to know is somehow being buried in this other vast quantity of information that I'm providing. And that for me is a big challenge. And that's what I would feed back to HFEA. I'd like them to actually look again at the code of practice. What's happened is over the years, we've added and added and added. And now the information booklets that I give to patients, they could, if we did print them out, if we weren't giving them electronically, there would be forests that would be decimated. So I can honestly from my heart say, when I'm inspected, it does not feel ineffective. But what it is potentially so I am complying with HA's guidance on what information should be provided. What maybe the gap here is that that's not what our patients want to know. We give them this ton of information, but it's something else. Maybe on cost, that's really clear on cost. But of course, there's been a requirement in the Code of Practice to have a costed treatment plan since long before I joined care. So I think that's where the gap is. I think the HFEA are doing their best with what they've got in their code and the law, but somehow that's not meeting patients' needs. And that's where we need to sort things out, would be my take. Sorry, I feel quite passionate.
I think it's fantastic is to say that, it's so wonderful to hear that, your patients, that can only imagine how thorough and everything that you're doing. The fact is, as you say, it's that there's clearly not always happening in patients. And I think everything you say is understanding of going from the patient perspective when it's saying such information as is proper. And so again, it's about making sure that that information is made available. And I completely agree. I did a talk last month exactly about evidence. It was at EBAR, all about what do patients want to know and what's important. And exactly the fact is being able to have co-design. However, I would say that the CMA as a guidance, being able to say making that information available. But I think it's exactly as you say, that saying you've clearly pointed out of saying, well, if we don't make that costed treatment plan available, then we're not compliant. Not every clinic is as diligent as that.
But I think also what's interesting, just to clarify something I said in my talk, I believe we have got good regulators in the ASC and the CMA, but I don't expect that it should be reliant on you. So what I'm saying is, the HFEA, we talk about powers actually. As a business, we know that the CMA, in the same way that the Information Commission's office, the HFEA can regulate us and make sure we protect people's data. The Information Commission's officers can fine us out of business. I'm not saying that that's right or proper, but in that context, if Rachel's inspectors come along to my clinic and say, this is terrible, this patient information's misleading, you are misleading patients, I wouldn't expect you to know that as a patient, or any of our patients to know that. What I would say is what the HFEA does have the existing power to do and should use is the ability to tell their fellow regulators and essentially grass us up and say, excuse me, CMA, this bunch here are not giving proper information, they could be misleading their patients. And then those regulators exist with all the skills and expertise and powers to fine us if they want to. So that's why I believe the CMA and the ASA can have a role, but I would expect the HFEA to be collaborating with those other regulators and saying, by the way, chaps, these people need punishing, get on with it. And that for me is a better use of resources than them reinventing that punishment wheel themselves.
I would just add that we do collaborate with other regulators, and we do have MOUs with other regulators, including like the CQC and the HTA. So we do obviously collaborate.
And I think Jane Stewart's made a good point in the Q&A. She thinks she made excellent points, Debra, about potential regulatory overreach. Indeed, professionals' standards are already regulated by professional bodies such as the GMC. And so can't there be a process of referral to other regulators? And this may help with the concerns around practice that it's considered to be unethical, for example, claims around paid for adjuvant treatments. And so I sort of wanted, because we've not heard from him for a while, wanted to bring Mohamed back in at this point to see what he thinks about that and how perhaps those other bodies could work with the HFEA, whether he thinks that's a good idea. Because as a doctor, as a business, as a holder of data, you're dealing with umpteen regulators, and I don't think the HFEA is particularly thinking about taking over from the data commissioner. So Mohamed.
I think as many of the panelists have said, I think we are not as clinics and as business and as clinicians, we're not just regulated by the HFEA. I think we are regulated by various other regulators, including the GMC, for example, that will actually determine whether as clinicians we have given wrong advice or done something that was not clinically justified and so on. And from personal experience, I know that the HFEA actually liaise with other regulators and they pass on information and so on. But again, the starting point is for the HFEA to be able to make an assessment on a clinical issue. I think maybe we need to look again at who's actually making those decisions, because if the starting point is wrong, then the cascade of events that will follow may not be appropriate, and maybe just again another waste of time of everybody. So I think the system as a whole, given the changing landscape of fertility and all the innovation that is currently available and all the rest of it, needs to be looked at very carefully by people who have maybe a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of experience with all those things, so that we can make sure that appropriate decisions and understanding of what exactly is available and who is it going to be presented to and so on and so forth. Because at the moment, I mean, I don't want to upset anybody coming to the last minute of this, but I actually think that the take of the HFEA generally on what is called add-on has actually ended up in confusing a lot of patients for a simple reason, because I think a lot of people do not appreciate that there is a substantial number of the treatment that are on the HFEA add-on list are actually treatments that cannot be provided in this country without actually a license from the HFEA. So if there is concerns about the efficiency and the way it's been presented, that it's exploitation and all the rest of it, then I think it's very easy for the HFEA to de-license those clinics, or to de-license those treatment. So I think we need to present a clearer information and a complete information, rather than maybe just headlines that are eventually end up confusing a lot of patients and actually cause a lot of mistrust between clinics and the patients, without any shred of evidence that the word like, okay, patients has been exploited and so on. I haven't actually seen any evidence that there is any clinic or anybody that has been actually found guilty of this kind of exploitation. This word has been repeatedly used in meetings and in interviews and all the rest of it. So I think we need to be a little bit careful before actually making those kind of statement and judgment, which I don't think actually serve or help the patient. And if anything, I think it adds to the confusion and cause a sense of mistrust between the providers and the patients as a whole.